Well, is this the beginning of the noose tightening around the president's neck, or is it still too early to call? Let's analyze this now with analyst and author, Professor Richard Calland. Prof, good afternoon. Thank you for your time. Welcome to today. So the panel has found that there are two cases of possible serious violations and also serious misconduct on the part of the president in terms of what happened at Parliamentary Farm. Does this now set the ball rolling for Parliament on Tuesday to resolve to impeach the president, or is it still too early to call? Are there more questions that need to be addressed?
Thank you, Dan, and good afternoon to you. So this is merely the start of a long potential process. It's stage one, and stage one is this preliminary investigation, which is now complete. The independent panel has said that the threshold of sufficient evidence has been satisfied. We can quarrel about whether they applied the right test in meeting their assignment. But regardless, until that report is judicially reviewed, if indeed the president decides to judicially review it, it stands and it triggers phase two, which is the parliamentary, purely parliamentary part of the process. But even then, Parliament, before it gets to a vote, must first establish an ad hoc committee, very similar to what's happened with the impeachment of the public protector, to conduct a full investigation with witnesses and cross-examination and the proper testing of the evidence before deciding on an objective, reasoned and evidence-based basis whether any of those two grounds for impeachment have been met, a serious violation of the law or serious misconduct by the president.
You've just mentioned a point which I think is key, that there could be a judicial review that the president may ask for. We'll have to wait and see. If that happened, what then would be the case?
Well, I think this is where the politics and the law begin to intertwine. Much is going to depend on what the president's attitude to this is. He clearly has a very difficult decision to make. And as that well-honoured, time-honoured expression in politics, he's no doubt considering his position. In other words, he's deciding whether it is indeed tenable for him to remain in office and to fight his corner, despite the findings of this panel, which are very serious. If he decides to fight on, then he has to say that, well, maybe not, but he may say, well, I don't accept that the approach of this panel was correct. His lawyers may advise him that it should be challenged, and he would be well advised, if he adopts that strategy, to launch judicial review proceedings as early as possible to demonstrate his commitment to this, and also maybe to seek some kind of interdictory relief to prevent Parliament from continuing with phase two in the way I described earlier.
So that if that happened, he would then continue. The status quo will remain until the review is over.
Potentially, but I think the political considerations now, Dan, are frankly far more weighty because of the sequence of events and the fact that his tenure as ANC president comes to an end in just 3 weeks' time. And of course, the atmosphere around the ANC, with competing factions, individuals seeking positions of power and influence within the party, means that this wounded political animal now, there will be people there smelling blood. And of course, the National Executive Committee meeting, whether it's tonight or tomorrow, will be considering how to handle this, including the possibility that they will decide that the president should be recalled. He may preempt all of this by falling on his sword. He may say, well, actually, the appropriate and right thing for me to do, the best course of action is to, with dignity, accept what has happened and withdraw and, in effect, resign as president.
Yeah, I mean, what we're witnessing, I'm going to borrow from your words in a recent opinion piece that you've written, Prof, which I read. I mean, this, whether you look at it from a constitutional lens or you look at it from, as you've just said, a political lens, this is a very significant moment, not just for Mr. Ramaphosa himself.
It's, Dan, you're absolutely right. It's hugely significant. This is constitutional democracy at work. And whoever we support and on whose side any politician or member of the public falls, one should in many ways celebrate the fact that this is a real constitution at work. This is a constitutional accountability. The president is being held to account for what took place. Whether that justifies an impeachment is a different question, but we should celebrate that fact. However, it's likely to be messy, and it's clearly causing great consternation and uncertainty, not least in the markets and not least in the eyes of investors around the world who, in general sense, regard Mr. Ramaphosa as a reform-minded president who has been making stellar, if not entirely fully successful, efforts to rebuild the state and put the economy on a different course. So it is a very delicate moment, politically and democratically, but it is also a constitutional democracy at work.
Yeah, and from the ramifications you've just expressed, it would mean it's important that the National Executive Committee of the ANC, which we've been told by Pule Mabe a short while ago, and you've also mentioned that it might be meeting today, virtually, this evening, or tomorrow, physically, that they deal with their decision-making on this matter urgently as possible.
Well, indeed, and it's not for me to give them advice, but I would hope that they would think about the wider consequences of this moment for the country, for the economy, and for ordinary people in this country who have been through and continue to suffer very difficult times socioeconomically. The fragility of the country is significant, and further uncertainty and political risk will not be helpful. So it needs a fairly firm and calm hand on the tiller at this point. And if Mr. Ramaphosa decides to go, then there must be a carefully managed transition. If he decides to fight on because he says that I've done nothing wrong and this report is unfair to me and unjust, then maybe his party should accept that and be supportive of him in that sense.
Okay, finally, just in a minute or so as we conclude, Prof, in that recent opinion piece of yours, which I was referring to, which I've read, you also make a point that this is the first time since Parliament adopted these new rules to guide the process for the impeachment of a president in 2018, following that Constitutional Court judgment. How do you, when you look and you have been observing, how do you think the panel carried its mandate in terms of this new process?
Well, I think it was not an easy task. They had a short time period. I think in the end, if I can be somewhat critical of the report, they fell between two stools. On the one hand, they say, well, our task is to look at this to see if there's primary facie evidence, which means at face value, is there a case to answer? But I think that's the wrong test, because the test, in the words of the rules, says sufficient evidence of a serious violation or serious misconduct. That, I think, is a higher test. So I think they may have misdirected themselves on the law, as it were. But in any case, they then went on, in fact, to conduct what I would call a half investigation. And they did look at some evidence, they weighed things up, and they used a balance of probabilities, and then they made findings based on that assessment of the evidence, even though their final word was, well, we can only go so far, and the full investigation will have to be done through the parliamentary process now that stage 2 has been triggered. So I think that if I was Mr. Ramaphosa and his lawyers, I'd be quite discontented by the approach taken by the panel. At times, the report is not well written. There's lots of typos. It looks like a bit of a rush job. And given the enormity of the moment and the gravity of this situation, I think it's really important that these processes are not just respected, but are carried out with impeccable kind of skill and diligence.